Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Chris Chang, and I'm the president of Unite, which is United's multicultural business resource group. Our mission at Unite is to promote racial and ethnic diversity, connect across cultures, and also foster an inclusive working environment for everyone at United. It is in support of this mission that we hold time and space for difficult but important conversations. Over the past year, almost 4,000 hate incidents have been reported against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community in the United States. I'm sure you've read about or seen videos of horrific acts of violence committed against people of AAPI descent. Anti-Asian hate has been discussed extensively within our AAPI communities, and it's driven a lot of anxiety, fear, and frustration and anger, but is now finally becoming part of a broader national dialogue. With our expert panelists today who come from the world of academia, activism, and cultural influence, we will learn about how the past year has affected the AAPI community and how awareness brought by today's discussion can help our communities moving forward. Before we begin today, I'd like to introduce United's Executive Vice President of Technology and Chief Digital Officer, who happens to be our BRG's executive sponsor, Linda Jojo.
Hey, Chris, thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is an important conversation on hate crimes towards our AAPI community. We've got a great lineup of panelists here today, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking. We got to get right to them. But I do want to thank the Unite team for putting this together. Chris, Rasan, Etka, Rohini, Susan, Carolina, and the rest of the team, thank you very much. You know, 2020 was a year of renewed consciousness on race and injustice in the United States. Employees, customers, and community expectations are changing. As a company rooted in connecting people and uniting the world, it's important that every member of the United family know you're heard, valued, and you belong. As you all know, when Scott transitioned to CEO, he put diversity, equity, and inclusion as an explicit goal for us as a company and as leaders. So when he asked me to consider being the executive sponsor of Unite, of course I said yes. And what I have learned since that time is that this BRG, more than any other, can stand for inclusion, especially. In the wake of the most recent violent acts against afflicting of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and in Atlanta and in numerous cities across the country, let me state the obvious. Crimes against any targeted community is a crime against us all. It's not our values or what we stand for at United. But hosting an event like this is, and discussing what it means to have an inclusive workplace is exactly what the Unite BRG is all about. In fact, this team was talking about having this conversation prior to the events in Atlanta. To speak further on both of the events in Atlanta and the ongoing trend of hate crimes against the AAPI community and cultural context of how it came to be, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. I don't think you're going to see their faces until I start talking, so just bear with me. First, Grace Chan McKevin, the Executive Director of the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community. Joanne Molinaro, founder of the Korean Vegan. Jez Chung, writer and transformation facilitator, and Dr. Russell Young, founder of the Stop AAPI Hate and professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. So now I'd like to hand it over to our moderator for today's discussion, Suzanne Chen. Suzanne?
Thanks, Linda and Chris. I am so excited to be a part of this event today. Such an important conversation to have. My name is Suzanne Chen. I am a senior onboard product design specialist on the marketing team, and I'm also the talent and markets chair on the Unite board. I'm really excited for our panelists to be here with us today and do our introductions. I have been following them on social media for the past year. I've seen them doing interviews. I've read their content. So really excited to get the chance to meet them and have this conversation today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Grace for our first introductions.
Hi, I'm Grace Chan McKevin. I'm the Executive Director for Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, CBCAC for short. We are a policy and advocacy organization based in Chicago's Chinatown. We work with the Chinese American community, both in the Chinatown and surrounding area. We call the greater Chinatown area in Chicago, which includes Chinatown, Bridgeport, McKinley Park, and some of the surrounding neighborhoods. But we also, on issues that uplift the entire Asian American community, also work with suburban Chinese American communities as well. And a little bit of my own background and how I came to this work of advocacy. I grew up in Hong Kong and came to the US as a high school student, so I really didn't have the typical Asian American experience or the typical immigrant experience, but throughout the years I've worked in academia and I've worked in government and business as well as nonprofits, and have in most of my work I've tried to work with communities that are marginalized and that need aid, and I think that the work with the coalition brings all of these different diverse experiences together. I was able to bring my relationships that I've built in government and in the business communities to help with bringing about systemic changes in our community. The coalition started in 1998 as an organization that was very grassroots. At that time, there were casino buses that were proliferating in Chinatown, picking up mostly seniors and first-generation immigrants to go to the casinos, and that was seen as harmful to the community because it literally takes money out of the pockets of the people that can afford the least to lose. And so over the years, after working on the casino bus issue, the coalition became known for working on civic engagement issues, voter registration, voter mobilization, census. 10 years ago, post-census, we worked on redistricting and was successful in getting 90% of the Asian Americans in the immediate region districted into one state rep district, and that resulted in Illinois' first state General Assembly member that's Asian. Representative Teresa Ma is still the representative that represents state representative that represents the Chinatown area and surrounding area, and I think that for us in particular, building power through representation, through raising our voices, through working through the community and through community organizations to uplift our issues and to also work with other non-Chinese Asian organizations and also non-Asian organizations is important. So with that, I will hand it over to the next person. I think it's Joanne, right?
Yes. Hi, this is Joanne Molinaro. Not sure if you can hear me. There we go. Hi, this is Joanne Molinaro. I'm the founder of The Korean Vegan, which is essentially a blog, but at this point serves as a community designed to provide a safe and empowering space for marginalized members or members of marginalized communities through storytelling and through food. I am also a trial lawyer at a large law firm here in Chicago, and I utilize my background in law to help inform and sometimes translate what's happening out there, particularly in law, for the members of my community so that they can feel empowered to act when they see injustice. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to participate in this panel with some pretty amazing guests, and I'm very much looking forward to a very robust discussion on this very important topic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Russell Jung. I'm co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, and I'm a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. I'd like to thank Unite BRG for inviting us. Thank you, Linda, Chris, and Susan for organizing this great panel. My family's been in the US for 6 generations, and every generation has experienced the racism and the violence that Asian Americans have met. In the 19th century, the diseases of cholera, smallpox, and leprosy were blamed on Chinese, and that's why the Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were 300 incidents of Chinese settlements being driven out. My family's village in Monterey was burned down, and they had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown. So that's the context of my family history of why we knew we needed to stop AAPI hate and collect the data of the racism that Asian Americans would experience during COVID-19. We knew similarly that we would be met with violence and racist policies, and that's what happened last year. And so I'm grieving. I know, like a lot of Unite employees, over the violence. I asked my 94-year-old mom, and she used to be a free-range chicken in San Francisco. She used to go everywhere. She should take the bus for free and go all over the place. But now I asked her, would you go out? And she said, no, I'd only walk around Clement Street, which is a Chinese neighborhood. So it's been 115 years since my great-grandparents had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown. And sadly, my own mom now doesn't feel free, doesn't feel safe. And I think a lot of the Asian American community feels similarly. I actually could give data how we're not sending our kids back to schools. Almost all my students tell their elderly to stay home. So that's what we're doing at Stop AAPI Hate. We're trying to address this racism, to work with allies, to document what's happening, and to really hold government accountable. So I look forward to this conversation and seeing how we could work with Unite to make changes.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you all for your introductions. To kick off the conversation and get us started and level set, so we're all on the same page of understanding what's been happening recently, I'm actually going to hand it back to Russell and ask, since you've started AAPI Hate, what has the organization found in terms of trend, what's been going on in the past year, and how is it different, if it's different, than what has historically happened to Asian Americans?
That's a great question. So we started collecting data last March, and up through February, we gathered 3,800 incidents self-reported by Asian Americans from across the nation. And the trends have been really consistent over time. There's 4 main types of discrimination. They're not all hate crimes. And so the focus on hate crimes, even though they're heinous, might be misguided, because racism is showing up at schools, online, and they're not necessarily crimes. So we have to get at the roots of racism to prevent it, rather than waiting for a hate crime to occur. And we have civil rights violations, we have online harassment, we have microaggressions, but they're not like verbal harassment, but they're racially traumatizing. 1 out of 5 of our respondents are showing signs of racial trauma, meaning they're hypervigilant and avoiding places, the hallmark of trauma. And we have physical assaults. 11% of our incidents are physical assaults, which can be hate crimes. Included in those assaults are coughing and spitting incidents. So people ask, have you seen an uptick in racism? I go, it's not an uptick, it's a continued surge. And it's clear there's an increase because people weren't coughing on in 2019, but now they're spitting at us. And 7% of our cases have people coughing and spitting at us. We're just being treated as outsiders and as objects. The physical assaults really show how racially biased it is. And 30% of the cases, others tell us to go back home. You don't. And so there is clear racial bias. There's clear. If you read our incidents, it's actually really sad to see how much hatred and anger is now directed towards Asian Americans. So much so that I wasn't surprised about the violence against our elders this year, nor the Atlanta shootings. Women are harassed 2.3 times more than men. Elderly and youth are also disproportionately represented. So people are attacking those whom they think are vulnerable. And it's, again, a national issue, like others have said. It's not an Asian American issue. It's a national issue of racism and violence that others have to deal with, that others need to address, because it's their issue, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that background, Russell. I think it's really important to call out that, like you said, it's not all hate crimes. A lot of it is hard to pinpoint, but even with microaggressions, like you said, it's traumatizing and it brings up really strong emotions for people. And like you said, feeling like an outsider, feeling like you're treated not as a person, but an object. And Joanne, I'm wondering if now, building on that, you could take us through the legal definition of a hate crime and what qualifies and what doesn't. And for these traumatic events that don't qualify as a hate crime, are there still options for legal recourse?
Yeah, happy to. And I'm so glad that Russell kind of made that distinction, because I do think it's important in order to have a productive and meaningful conversation to understand the difference between a hate incident, which has a much broader definition, while not diminishing the impact of hate incidents, but then also understanding what a hate crime actually is, because that's a phrase that's now been thrown around a lot and we're all hearing about it in the news and everybody is getting extremely emotional about it, understandably. So a hate crime under the law, it's going to vary a little bit here and there. And in some cases, those variances will be important across the 50 states, because each state, well, I should say this, not all states even have hate crime laws. So that's something to remember. Georgia just passed its hate crime law less than a year ago, and that was in response to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. So you can see even there, it's a very complicated thing because not all states are going to have hate crime statutes. Those states that do have hate crime statutes, fundamentally, it's really about a crime that is committed based upon animus towards a perceived group, and that group can be any number of protected classes. And when you think about protected classes, particularly when you're thinking about constitutional law, you're thinking about gender, you're thinking about race, and in some states, sexual orientation. So these are the very, understood protected classes that I think we're all very used to talking about. In Georgia, for example, which is, kind of now a lot of people are focused on what is a hate crime in Georgia. Those are indeed protected classes. So that would be a hate crime, is if a person committed a certain category of crime. Certainly murder would qualify as one of those categories. And part of that crime was motivated by an animus towards a protected class. Now, what's really, really interesting is in some states, for example, in Illinois, which is where I'm from, it doesn't even need to be the main motivator for committing the crime. So you can have a mixed motivation. Well, I'm committing this crime because I'm angry, or because I'm upset, or because I need money, or any number of things. But I'm also going to do it against this particular person because I have a motivation to do it against an Asian person. So even if your motive for committing the crime is mixed, that doesn't necessarily exclude it from being categorized as a hate crime. Now, what I think is really important to remember is, even if, from the layperson's perspective, looking from the outside in, it seems like, well, everything pretty much adds up. It's pretty clear that this crime was motivated by a perceived hatred of an Asian person or the Asian race. You also have to look at it from the perspective of the prosecutor. They need to prove that the mental motivation, what was going on in the mind of that person when committing that crime. And from an evidentiary perspective, they need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is an incredibly high burden. So even if everything sort of lines up statutorily and you think, well, this should be an easy case, it's really important to remember prosecutorially, it may actually be a lot harder. And what they don't want to do is jeopardize the most important conviction, which of course in the case of Atlanta would be murder. One other thing to remember is, what are the stakes here? What are we talking about? Well, in Georgia, all it means is that you get to add 2 years on to the sentence. That's what getting convicted of a hate crime means in Georgia. Under federal law, the penalties are much steeper if you get from just a regular felony to a hate crime felony. So those are things that also need to be taken into consideration when you're thinking about, is this something that should be prosecuted as a hate crime?
Thank you, Joanne. That was really enlightening. And, you know, as you mentioned with the recent Atlanta events, a lot of people online are going back and forth on, you know, whether the specific incidence was a hate crime. But, you know, it seems like oftentimes it doesn't end up mattering, right? What happened is what happened, and the justice system may not be fully equipped in its current state to protect us against these things that are happening to Asian American communities and other marginalized groups. Grace, would you be able to next take us through some of the work that you've been doing in Chicago, and maybe how these events have been affecting communities here? Like, I know that we see oftentimes, it feels like every day in the news a hate incident is happening, but they seem focused in New York and the Bay Area, for example. Are there things that have been happening in Chicago, and what have community leaders here been doing?
Yeah, so ever since the more publicized incidents started in New York and in California, we've been asked in Chicago about the incidents, and we've been saying that we have not seen the numbers, nor have we seen the level of violence, and there have been very small numbers that have been reported to police, and even among community leaders, community organizations, we've heard very little. But we've also known that people tend not to report because of language barriers and mistrust of police and not knowing the system and so on. So after the Atlanta incidents, my organization, CBCAC, and Midwest Asian Health Association, which is a local Chicago, greater Chicago-based organization that offers health and mental health services, decided that we would just do a straw poll, like literally a 5-question survey in Chinese on WeChat, the Chinese social media, and we only ran it for 4 days. And in 4 days, there were 143 people that responded, and out of that, 88 had said that they have experienced some kind of discrimination, some kind of bullying, and most of them attributed it to the fact they think that it was because of their Asian heritage. And then most importantly, the majority of them, 90-something%, did not report to police because they believed that it would not be of use to report to police. So I think that even though it's not a scientific study, and we'll probably need to dig deeper into it in other Asian communities as well in the Chicago area and in Illinois, because I think Russell's website only recorded 92 incidents in Illinois, as opposed to 3,800 across the nation. And so we also need to know that some of the reports are not being reported because people didn't have access, either language or the know-how to report.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, that's really disappointing and saddening to hear, because with a lot of these events, it's the vulnerable population within the Asian American community, our elders, recent immigrants, the working class that have less access to resources, and like you said, maybe more of a mistrust of the system, that are being targeted. So I guess thinking about that, I'm wondering, Joanne, from a legal perspective, do you have any ideas or insights on, what can be done, whether it's reforming of the system or any sort of like community support that can, provide more of a voice to people that feel like they're too afraid to speak up for themselves right now?
So, and I was thinking about this question on my run this morning. I was like, how do you get to this problem? How do you get to a solution? And there's so many different parts of this problem, and I think it needs to be attacked from a lot of different directions. I think that, and I'm focusing more on sort of the teeth of the hate crime statute, because I find it almost sort of toothless right now. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why, there's this sense where it provides emotional justice and satisfaction to the API community, because they're suffering and they're in pain right now. And they want these cases to be prosecuted and treated as hate crimes. But legally, that really doesn't move the ball forward very much, particularly if it's going to be a local case, which is what will likely occur in Atlanta. I don't think I don't know. I mean, it's possible, but it's unlikely to be prosecuted in federal court. And then you really are just looking at a couple-year enhancement to the sentence. So if that's the case, then you really do need to tackle it from a legislative perspective, in my view. And part of that means, well, you need to increase the penalties if it is found to be a hate crime. And then the other thing is, you may need to make it a little bit less difficult to prove. So these are, a couple of things from a legislative perspective that needs to be done. Well, how is that done? Well, part of it is representation. I cannot stress enough the importance of representation. We had a House resolution that passed last year, basically condemning Asian hate and Asian hate crimes. And there are over 100 Republican House members who refused to vote in favor of it because they don't believe in hate crimes. And they don't believe that doing something on the basis of race should be a crime. That's basically what it is, what it boils down to. And therefore, I do think that part of the solution is getting the vote out among the Asian American community, among the AAPI community. We need to be educating our voters about the issues that are important to them and the power that they have when it comes to voting. I think that needs to happen. I think the other part of the solution is we need to normalize this discussion of what actually is Asian hate. What is a hate incident? What is racism? Because what I saw happening, at least with regard to the press conference that was held by the sheriff's offices, these law enforcement members may not be properly educated about what a race crime actually even looks like, and may not know how to collect evidence to prosecute a hate crime. So how do we educate our law enforcement and the public at large about what all is involved with a hate incident, what is actually racism against an Asian American person looks like? And I think that conversation is one of the reasons why these types of panels is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Joanne. And, thinking about, what exactly is racism, I had a personal LinkedIn post that made its way around a lot of the United population. And in it, I talked about, feeling particularly affected by these recent events in Atlanta because, people were offering condolences, but oftentimes a lot of behavior that I see in the company that's not that does not come from a place of malice, but things like not knowing how to pronounce my name or things like overlooking my accomplishments. They get to the root of a lot of microaggressions that I experienced growing up in school and in college, and it's a pattern, a lifetime of feeling like not belonging, of feeling like an outsider. And Russell, you touched on this earlier too. So I'm hoping, can you expand on the perpetual foreigner effect and this narrative around race?
Thanks. Yeah, I am glad that Joanne raised the issue that we need to change the narrative of understanding race, of how we define hate crimes, and even how we understand who belongs to be in America, right? And who belongs. That for me is part of the roots of the racism against Asian Americans, is that we're not being racialized the way whites and blacks are. We're outside that white-black binary because we're neither white nor black. But rather, we're racialized as whether we're insiders and belong or outsiders and excluded. And, when we're insiders, we're model minorities, but when we're outsiders, we're perpetual foreigners. And you see that again in our incidents when people tell us, go back home, you don't belong here, you brought the disease. Even though we've been here for 5 generations, we're the ones who still brought the disease. So, and it's clear that type of outsider racialization has been institutionalized. Last year, the administration cut migration visas, so we couldn't reunite families, cut Chinese scientists and researchers, cut H-1B visas, cut refugee resettlement. All these policies excluded and disproportionately impacted Asians. So I think what's really operative now is the stereotype that Asians are foreigners who don't belong. And since they're outsiders, like other groups, we can, like others who we build a wall towards, we can exclude them, we could objectify them, we can spit and cough at them, and we could shoot at them, we could hypersexualize them. So this perpetual foreigner stereotype is much more insidious than like the model minority stereotype. It's widespread. It's how our immigrant parents, I think, experience life a lot more. Maybe Unite employees who are more educated, who speak English, you may experience the model minority, but I know that immigrants, and especially those in working class, low income areas, they experience being outsiders a lot more. They're bullied and attacked a lot more for their accents, for the way they look. And so this stereotype as perpetual foreigners is dangerous, insidious, widespread, and killing us. And so to change the narrative, this is the Asian American moment where we could actually rethink what justice is in America. Because justice, racial justice, is really a white-black divide. But how do we disrupt that insider-outsider binary? That's what we have to contribute. We can actually say, let's imagine America where there are no insiders and outsiders, right? And as we join Black Lives Matter, as we work in partnership, we dismantle both types of racialization to reimagine America.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you, Russell. I think it's really important to expand the broader discussion. So like you said, it's not just about race, it's about justice, it's about who fits in and who belongs in America. And Grace, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about in recent times, as the Asian American community is mobilizing, following a summer of mobilizing for the Black Lives Matter movement last year. How can we make sure that, as Russell mentioned, we're doing it in conjunction and in a way that supports each other in solidarity?
Yeah, I think particularly in ethnic enclaves like Chicago's Chinatown or any other Chinatown, there's a concentration of Asian Americans and in particular Chinese Americans, and there are so many Chinese American groups. It's easy for the groups to center the Chinese voices, and especially when they see some crimes being perpetrated by either African American or Latinx and folks in Chicago's Chinatown, because it neighbors Pilsen, which is largely Latinx, to the west, and then to the east and north and south are mostly African American neighborhoods. There's a lot of anti-Blackness that goes on in the rhetoric, particularly in the Chinese language social media, and there's a lot of that to overcome. So I think that intentional gatherings of groups help. There was a very large support Black Lives and Dignity March in the summer in August that was organized by, actually, ironically, by suburban Christian churches that then invited a Chinese church and an African American church to join together. So the march started in Chinatown, and then, had a prayer at the Chinese church, and then marched down Wentworth Avenue for really about a mile, maybe a little more than a mile, to an African American church straight down the road. And those two churches had never had any contacts before. And I think that the message was to bring unity, but I think that as there needs to be more moments like that. My organization started a series of conversations in Chinese with first generation Chinese immigrants to talk about the history of race and racism in this country, and to explain the history of racism against Asian Americans and the history of racism against other groups, including Blacks and Latinx and Native folks, so that the participants can understand the commonalities and the shared experiences and how to support each other and build solidarity. Is difficult because it takes a while for attitudes to change and for these ideas for folks to be able to wrap their brains around solidarity across races. But I think these are very necessary.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, it's really nice to hear about how the community is coming together for each other. I was just browsing through the event Q&A to see if there are any questions we can address right now relevant to the conversation, and there are a lot of Joanne fans out there. And so taking, solidarity and connection through another approach. Joanne, would you tell us about how you've used storytelling and food to both spread awareness and call for action with your fans, audience members, people who engage in your content?
Absolutely. So I think what Grace just said is so important, is trying to create touch points between the various communities. And I'm so glad Grace tackled it in a very eloquent way, which is there is a history of a great deal of tension and mistrust between the AAPI community and the Black American community. I understand that there's also a history of great coalition building and amazing work that's been done when the two communities come together. But I also think it would do a disservice to our work if we didn't sort of look at the amount of trust that we now need to rebuild. That is a big job, I think, for both communities. One of the things that I like to do with the Korean Vegan, and this was intentional, is, well, I said, okay, everybody needs to eat food. I don't care what color you are, what race you are, how old you are. I don't care who you are. If you are a human being, you need to eat food. And so the Korean Vegan, obviously, it attempts to veganize Korean food. That was selfish because I'm Korean and I was scared that I would never eat Korean food again if I went vegan. And so I started veganizing Korean food, and I tried to make it as accessible and delicious looking as possible to invite as many people to my papsang, which means Korean table, dining table in Korean. I want people to come to my dinner table. And if you think about it from that perspective, when you have a dinner party and you're serving food at that dinner table, you don't just sit there and eat and not talk to people. It's not like you're like this. You actually engage in conversation. You tell each other what's been going on in your life, tell each other stories from your childhood, from your families. And that was what I tried to do with the Korean Vegan. But I wanted my storytelling to be about the immigrant story. I wanted people to humanize the immigrant story so that while they're enjoying oftentimes Korean food, they'd also be hearing about how my parents came to the United States, how they, struggled through their language barriers, how they got their jobs. My father had to give up a degree from Yonsei University and work, in manual labor for his entire career. But he did that because he believed so much in the American dream and the dream of democracy. He believed that so much, and how heartbreaking it has been for him to watch what's been happening, particularly with the Capitol riots. That was very hard for him to watch because this was not the country that he believed in when he immigrated here. And now it's even doubly hard to know that people of his skin color are being targeted for violence. Again, that was not the country he dreamt about when he was a 20-year-old in South Korea. So hearing these stories, I'm hoping that, whatever race you are, whatever background you are, you can find some point of commonality and say, I can relate to that. I know what it feels like to be alone. I know what it feels like to feel different. I may not know exactly, but I know enough, and I'm willing to open my heart and my mind to this story because I can relate to it. And you know, I don't know if it's affected a lot of people, but every time I hear a message from someone saying, hey, I'm a white woman from Alabama, I'm a police officer, I know absolutely nothing about kimchi or Korean food, but I can relate to your story, and I find that incredible. That is the most rewarding thing about what I've been able to do as the Korean vegan. So I'm hoping through storytelling and through emotional impact, I can leave a small imprint on people so that they remember these things the next time they vote, the next time they have a conversation with a person of color, the next time they are asked about a particular immigration policy.
Joanne, that was really incredible to hear. Thank you for sharing that. For me personally, like I can also identify with a lot of the stories that you tell, and I've found myself crying just like watching some of your videos. And I think it's really powerful to share so much of yourself in such a public forum. And I think that puts people, even though you're not directly interfacing with them, it puts people more at ease and gives them a feeling of empowerment of being able to talk more about their own stories and maybe not feeling shame or guilt or these like negative emotions that might be associated with your past, especially for people that are immigrants, for people that feel like they don't belong or out of place. So with that, I think I would love to hear a bit from Jez on a similar note of the type of work that you do in your workshops of guiding people to finding their own voice and their sense of self, and how that's particularly important for the Asian American community in times like this.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see and hear me now. So sorry about those technical difficulties, and thanks everyone for the patience. And I'd like to just name what a great honor it is to be in conversation with Joanne, Russell, and Grace, because I had a chance to, I was frantically looking on my phone trying to join Teams on my phone, so I got to listen in on some of what they were saying. And I think this panel is so well curated and showing us that there's no one way to speak up. There's no one way. And I truly believe that we are all here for a unique purpose and reason. That's so much of what guides my work. And I believe that, it can be really intimidating sometimes, right? Especially if you identify as someone of a non-dominant identity, whether that be a person of color or queer identifying or neurodivergent. And, as someone who identifies as all of those intersections of identities, I've definitely felt really just insecure in what I had to say. Like, what could I say? What is my area of expertise? What is the way that I can speak up that can create change? Because it gets really heavy, right? We're talking about really heavy topics. We're talking about systemic racism. We're talking about years of this perpetual foreigner stereotype. We're talking about legislation that has led to what we're seeing now. So I think it can get heavy. And during those times, I like to just bring it back to the self. And so a lot of the work I do is about self-development, like self with a capital S. What does that look like to really tune into what does my body need at this time? How do I care for myself? Because when I practice that with myself, then I can help care for the people around me. And we're talking about solidarity, right? We're talking about moving in unison with the Black liberation movement. And they have so clearly stated within the past year, and really the past 7 or more years that they've been in action, that we need to divest in systems of harm, and that means our language. That means the ways that we speak to each other, the ways that we relate to each other, and invest in care. Divest in harm, invest in care. And that really starts with us. It starts with us and the direct people that we are in communication with on a daily basis. So I want to name that, speaking up is a practice. And if you're here, I thank you for being here, because this is a practice. Listening is a practice. Active listening, active learning from people who are committed to this, so that you too can learn how to be committed to anti-racism, to advocacy, to care. And again, I believe that everyone is an advocate in their own way.
Thank you so much, Jez. I think, for me, with the recent events and, trying to learn more about my identity and how I interact with people in the world because of who I am and because of who other people are, like you said, it's a very introspective experience. And it's learning a lot about being in tune with, like you said, your body and your needs, and making space to like care for yourself and allowing for yourself to ask for what you need. So in relation to speaking up as a practice, I think there's the stereotype that Asian Americans are quiet, they're docile. That's not true. And Grace, I was hoping you could talk us through what are some of examples throughout history of Asian American activism and things that we've had to respond to in the past.
Yeah, I think I want to, kind of go back to a little bit further in history. I think we focus quite a bit on the increase in anti-Asian hate incidents during the pandemic, and focusing on, the rhetoric that the former president had with the China virus and so on. But the anti-Asian racism actually started from the very beginning. From when Asian Americans were brought to the U.S., when the Chinese laborers were brought to work on the railroads and in the gold mines, and being erased from history. The Transcontinental Railroad, at the conclusion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese Americans were not even included in the photograph when all the laborers were photographed. So I think that that goes a very long way with the anti-Asian American incidents. So it's not, and then everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Japanese American incarceration, we get ignored and erased over and over again. Or as Russell said, we're always either the foreigner or we're the model minority. And I think that all of these are harmful stereotypes, and it gets perpetuated in mainstream media, and we're often portrayed not as, normal, regular people. I used to laugh about it that, that we hardly ever see Asian Americans on TV ads. And advertisement, by the way, is probably trailing phenomenon rather than leading, because usually you don't see people represented in advertisement until something has become mainstream and the norm. And for a really, really long time, you never see an Asian American face unless it's very stylized. They're practicing Kung Fu, or they're doing something, that's obviously Asian. And it wasn't until a few years ago that people started doing normal things like walking down the street or washing their hair, or something that normal people do. And I think that all of these stereotypes are things that we would need to continue to fight against. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace, for sharing that. Like you said, there's a long history of this happening, and though Asian Americans have been more normalized in the media, it's still something that we're continuing to fight against. And with this history of discrimination, Russell, you mentioned that your family has personal experience with this. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about that if you're comfortable? And is this something that you talked about, like growing up in your family? Did you always know that this happened, or did you learn about this later when you were in academia?
My family talked about it. My dad, he graduated from college and couldn't get work until African Americans actually integrated federal government and pushed for government work, and then Asians were able to follow African Americans into government and that kind of work. So we really, my immediate parents benefited from the civil rights movement and from even integration after World War II. Actually, we also benefited from the GI Bill, and so a lot of African Americans couldn't buy homes because they were excluded from that GI Bill, but we were able to get out of Chinatown because we benefited from white affirmative action, although we're Asian. Throughout history, my family, again, with 5 generations, we've experienced all the racism that Asian Americans have dealt with. My family, again, was displaced in Monterey. They had to go to segregated schools in San Francisco, Chinatown. When my grandfathers came over, or my maternal grandfather, he had to take on a paper son name in order to come to the US, and he was an illegal, undocumented person. My grandmothers were detained in Angel Island, and 10% of those going through Angel Island, again, because of health reasons, we have racialized bodies. If they were seen to be unfit, they would be sent back, right? They're detained longer and then they get deported. So 10% of Asian Americans going through Angel Island didn't even make it to the US, and that's an untold story. Again, both on my mother's and father's side, they faced family separation, government sanctioned or government enforced family separation because they had tuberculosis and had to go through homes. So because of health policies and the racialization of Asians as outsiders, my family has been excluded, quarantined, detained, deported, and had family separation, right? Mm-hmm. And even I had gotten tuberculosis because I hung around Chinatown, and there's so much environmental racism in these crowded, low-income areas. So, and it continues today, right, with my kids and how they're having to deal with COVID-19 and the racial bullying that kids are experiencing now. So today, Asian Americans are the racial group least likely to send their kids back to school. So again, racism is impacting us where we can go, if we have educational opportunity, whether we can go back to work. Asian Americans aren't sending their kids back to school, not because they're afraid of the pandemic, but because they're afraid their kids will get attacked on the way as they walk with their grandparents, or they would be racially bullied in the school. Okay, and here's my last staggering stat. We surveyed those who responded to Stop AAPI Hate, and we asked them, what's the greatest stressor during the pandemic? And those who've experienced racism said it's racism is their number one fear. And if you think about it, it's really stunning that Asian Americans are more afraid of other Americans being hateful towards them than they are of a pandemic that's killed 500,000 people, right? We're in a state of siege. We're more fearful about other Americans' racism than a pandemic that's killed 500,000 people. Again, that's how bad the racism is. That's how traumatizing it is. That's how widespread it is. It's so history has been repeating itself. It's been impacting my family. And the other thing that the narrative changes, Asians have always resisted this racism. And that's why Joanne and Grace and Jez, they're all like fierce heroes who are standing up to the racism. So I think that's the narrative that we have to tell, our legacy of resisting racism and joining other groups for racial justice.
Thank you, Russell. Yeah, as I mentioned in the intro, I'm continually inspired by everyone on this panel, by the content that we put out, that and the way, like you said, that you're changing the narrative of how we can reclaim our identities and our stories. And Russell, you touched on, with your family, this generational trauma of all of the different ways that your parents and your grandparents and you have experienced racism in different forms throughout history. And it looks different and it feels different, but it's the same root cause. And I think a lot of immigrant families have these experiences of generational trauma that even for their children who have grown up in the U.S. or are several generations into growing up in the U.S., we hear stories, we experience it when we watch it happen to our parents. And, I want to throw a question to Joanne in particular, thinking about, you're a partner at a law firm in Chicago. It's a very professional corporate environment. Do you feel like you can be your whole self at work? And obviously you found this different outlet to tell your story. And I'm wondering, how can we better bridge the gap of, being anti-racist in a professional environment where, professionalism often means sticking to the status quo, and not bubbling up too much noise when it's unnecessary?
Well, that's a very tough question. I would say that I have felt that I have been allowed to be my complete professional self at work. You know, my job is my job, and part of the reason I have felt so comfortable with my professional self at work is because at least my organization, my firm, has been incredibly supportive of me personally. So they haven't tried to stifle my communication, my, you know, beliefs, or have told me, oh, you can't say things like that. You know, they have been very supportive of, you know, me speaking out on these issues, or even just being creative. You know, a lot of them are like, I can't wait for your cookbook to come out. So, you know, I think at least part of it, I think, of course, is just fostering an environment that not just acknowledges, but supports the personal life. And that's really important for not just, you know, anybody, you know, a person of color, but for anybody. That's, you know, I know May is also Mental Health Awareness Month. That is a huge part of, you know, mental health, is acknowledging and supporting the personal life. And, you know, my firm does a fabulous job of that. I think my firm is also learning to do a better job of supporting you know, those who are affected by incidents like these. And that's been very encouraging for me as well. You know, they came out with a very strong statement in support of BLM last summer, and that meant a huge deal for me. And so I think in that way, you know, that has been what has allowed me to function very comfortably as a professional. I don't, you know, sit there and talk about these issues, you know, certainly not every day, to all of my colleagues. Hey, I want to talk to you about what's been going on, or have you talked about race lately? I mean, it's certainly not what I do. It's just couldn't really function as a professional if that's what I was doing at my firm all the time. But I do think ultimately my partners, my colleagues, they're immensely supportive of me personally and professionally. And, you know, that's what has allowed me to really freely engage in the work that I do outside.
That's really great to hear, Joanne. And I really liked that you highlighted, you know, a way that individuals can contribute to anti-racism and these like big systemic issues is just providing personal support, and, you know, giving space to allow people to say what they're feeling and talk about themselves in the ways that they feel comfortable. Thinking about identity and how a lot of these recent incidents have affected women. Grace also talked about the history of Asian Americans being ignored and erased in history and events that we've been a big part of. There was a quote in Minor Feelings that I really resonated with, where Kathy Park Hong talks about, you know, she's writing very fiercely and trying to speak out and let her voice come out, but she's like watching her own hand disappear as this is happening. And so these are a lot of like disparate thoughts, but I'm hoping Jazz maybe can help me pull them together and understand, you know, how do these feelings of being erased, of these microaggressions that really traumatize people, how do they affect the psyche of, you know, Asian Americans as a whole, if that's a phenomenon that's happening, and what personal work can we do to try and overcome this? Jazz, I think you're still on mute.
Let's see.
Perfect.
Now? Okay, we're good now. That's a great question, and I highly recommend Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong to everyone. I won't say it's a comprehensive book, right? Because Asian American Pacific Islanders are not a monolith, and everyone has their own experiences, but it's such a poetic, profound, just collection of, yeah, how does it affect the psyche to be in this perpetual foreigner narrative, or not be in this black-white binary narrative, and how do you kind of find your own place in that? So I feel like it's, and to echo something that Joanne said in this idea of workplace inclusion, right? Because I work in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, and when you show up as, as yourself, however much you can in any workspace, it affects your psyche if you're constantly masking as someone else or code switching, or there's so much language when you're talking about in these predominantly white cis het spaces. So I think that, diversity I see as the door. You're invited into the door. Inclusion I see as how comfortable you feel inside that house. And then equity I see as how much influence and access do you have to the entire property, to make decisions, to make impact. Because diversity is nothing without inclusion. Inclusion is nothing without equity. So when I hear people talk about diversity inclusion, I push them to say, talk about equity, because that's what we're trying to build, long-term impact. We're trying to sustain that movement. So I think that in the workplace, you can, especially nowadays, I think it's really important to remember how these current events and the news cycle can be affecting someone when they come into work. They might not feel comfortable talking about it because they don't want to bring it up, and then kind of that kind of rocks their nervous system, like physically, so they can't show up in meetings the way that they want to, or they may not feel comfortable because they haven't been well received before when they talked about their race or their own identity and experiences. And a few things that come up, a few things that we often hear is, in terms of perpetual foreigner narrative, we hear, no, where are you really from? Or you don't belong here, or go back to your country, or you speak really good English. How are you so articulate? And then in terms of model minority, we hear, oh, but why are you complaining? You have it so good. Or are you sure that was racism? When we kind of bring up a microaggression, are you sure that was racism? Are you sure you're not making it up? Are you sure it's not in your head? Or, well, if they can do it, like, look, there's a successful Asian over there, why can't you? So we also see, and I'm sharing these things because I want us to interrupt it. I want us to interrupt these cycles of when there's studies that say Asian Americans are least likely to be promoted to leadership positions. So we hear, oh, she lacks presence, or she lacks leadership qualities, or they have really great work ethic and we can always count on them. They've overcome so much adversity. When we just continue to say those things about our coworkers, we are unknowingly kind of contributing to that pattern and that cycle of them not getting promotions, getting passed up, not being recognized for their achievements and everything. So when it comes to identity in the workplace and kind of supporting people's growth and equity, again, ultimately equity, I think it's important to identify when people are saying that and interrupt it and say, hey, can we think about it in a different way? Hey, how about we reframe that?
Thank you, Jez. I really appreciated that. A lot of what you said was very specific in terms of actions that we can all take and things to look out for. Shifting gears a little bit, there have been quite a few questions in the Q&A about the recent anti-Asian hate incidents and calling into question who the perpetrators are, whether it's their race or their gender or whatever. And I'm wondering, Grace, could you talk on that? Does it matter who's perpetrating these crimes? Does that affect how we should look at what's happening?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. I think a lot of times people focus on the specific race of the perpetrators. Like in Atlanta, it happened to be a white male. In some other situations, it may not be. And what we want to call out is really systemic racism in this country. It's the system of centering the dominant group. So all that we've been talking about, how throughout history, the Eurocentric, white-centric interpretation of culture and of history and what the dominant what the dominant culture is, and subsuming all the other cultures that people of color. Native Americans, for example, are really the folks that have been in this country the longest, and yet they've been displaced, they've been erased from narratives. And I think that that ultimately also drives intergroup conflict, right? The reason that East Asians, South Asians, and Arabs end up running small businesses in predominantly Black neighborhoods is because those businesses, those rents may be cheaper. That's what they can afford. And then with some of those presents, there are some inter-ethnic conflicts. And so when people look at specific cases and take their eye off of the overall systemic oppression and systemic racism, that's not helpful, because it doesn't solve the issue. And what we want to do is, just like Jess said, think about equity, think about how we can make things better for the entire country, for the entire system as a whole.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, stepping back and looking at the whole picture is really important in these instances. We've been getting a lot of engagement in Q&A, which we really appreciate. I'm so glad that you have so many attendees actively participating and listening. With that, I'm going to hand it over officially to Rohini, who's going to run and moderate the Q&A portion to continue the discussion.
Thanks, Suzanne. And thank you to all the panelists. And again, to echo Suzanne's words earlier, thank you to everyone for this incredible engagement. We've got questions flying over here, so I'm going to do my best to kind of aggregate some of the questions that are some of the common themes we have in the Q&A, and also take a look. Feel free to kind of vote up and down if there are questions that you really want answered, and that'll be a good way to sort, recognizing that we only have a limited amount of time. So one of the questions that came pretty early on, and I saw a lot of interest in, was if this is a uniquely American problem. I know we're talking about Asian Americans, but is this an issue that we're seeing sort of leveraged against Asians in other countries? And maybe Russell, if you would mind speaking to this.
Yeah, sadly, it is a global phenomenon. So there is, because the disease comes from China, there's a lot of xenophobia, and it's also historic, like it is in the United States. So we have research partners in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, England, and they all report similar trends, that there are hate crimes, also a lot of hate incidents. Majority are hate incidents of harassment, being barred from establishments, being shunned on public transit, businesses being vandalized. So actually, it's eerie how similar the patterns are. And what's actually, for me, even more striking is that our partners in Australia said, actually, it is the term Chinese virus and the political rhetoric that goes across oceans, and that hate speech leads to hate violence. And so whenever whoever has a powerful platform, their words really do matter, and that hate speech does go viral globally. And so they would argue it's not just a local phenomenon, but there's global racism as well. Again, a lot of countries do. There are the two sources is, one is that Asians are excluded from countries. So they were excluded from, there's a history of exclusion in Canada, there's a history of exclusion in Australia. So that Asians as being a group to be excluded, to be outsiders, is one source. And the other is relationships with China, like international relationships with China. So China is really an easy target to make an enemy, but when governments or politicians make China the enemy, it makes the people the enemy as well. And people don't distinguish between a government's policies and the people. So a lot of countries now have animosity and friction with and conflict with China as a state, but China bashing leads to the bashing of Chinese people and people who look like Chinese. And the problem, we have to figure out how to unroot that insider-outsider binary. We have to figure out how to do foreign relations well without, again, harming individual peoples.
Thank you, Russell. I think those are really sort of powerfully kind of dovetail into another question we were getting, which was really how much are we seeing in terms of these incidents since the COVID pandemic began. So thank you for addressing what is not an uptick, but sort of a change in framing of some of these anti-AAPI incidents. Another question we got, or it was a comment I thought was really interesting, was about the diversity within the AAPI community. And I know at Unite we've talked about AAPI not just being sort of one broad monolith. So I was wondering if one of our panelists would like to speak to diversity we have within the AAPI community, and if education, the question we got was whether education about this diversity can help lead to the healing and solutions against the racism that we're seeing. And I don't know, maybe Jez, if you have a perspective on this. I'm just calling on people here, but you're on my screen, so if you could help speak to this.
We're good now. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a group that makes up, and Russell, Grace, or Joanne, correct me if I'm wrong, but over 50 countries and regions and over 100 dialects and languages, right? We're talking about East Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, and Pacific Islands. It's so vast. And this is a group that just doesn't, it's so, I guess the history of even Asian American when it was formed in the 60s by these UC Berkeley graduate students to create solidarity among Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans in the Bay Area. It was created for solidarity, and now we're trying to continue that solidarity, but adapt it to our needs and what we need in terms of political action, social action, cultural action. And another thing I think that we don't realize is that when we say stop Asian hate, that means protect the people who are least protected, which is elders, which is low income, which is working class, which is disabled Asians, which is also multiracial Asians. This is undocumented Asians, migrant Asians, first gen, second gen, third gen, fourth gen, Asian adoptees. We're talking about such a wide, vast group. And I'll throw over to Russell too, because I'm sure he has additional thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we are a really diverse population, but what's interesting about this moment is I actually see a real strong Asian American unity. And what we're doing is building on the Justice for Vincent Chin movement, where in the 1980s, a Chinese person was killed for being mistaken as a Japanese person by laid-off auto workers. We're building off of the resistance to Islamophobia after 9/11. So we're joining with our South Asian, Muslim, and Arab American brothers and sisters. In fact, Stop AAPI Hate is led by Manju Kulkarni, and the National Table, a national coalition, is led by Artie Kohli. And so we're using an understanding of how people attacked and the policies implemented against the Muslim community after 9/11, and the strategies of how to report, how to resist, how to mobilize. And I think that's been really, really important at this moment. And that's why I think we've come together so quickly. Here's a quick story. We actually planned early on, knowing what happened to Arabs and to Muslims, planned for scenarios of mass shootings, because that's what happened to the Sikh community. We planned for racial profiling. We planned for deportation of our communities, because that's all what happened in the 2000s. And they all sadly occurred in this period. So 60% of our respondents are not Chinese. So this is a Pan-Asian issue that we're really drawing together. Asian Americans did vote like Joanne recommended, and we voted 2-1 for Biden because racism was a primary motivating factor. So although we're really diverse and we want to recognize a lot of the groups and the differences, and we don't want to mask the disparities, this is also a really strong time for the Asian American community to come together. And I've seen groups really unite. I've seen people from all walks of life, like Jez said, different types of communities, different types of people, from high school students to, airline executives, really standing up for the community. And I think I'm really proud, actually. I'm really devastated by what's happening, but what heartens me and gives me strength is seeing the Asian American community unify.
Thank you, Russell. I think, one of the most prevalent and commonly asked questions I'm seeing in the chat here is really about a call to action and allyship, having, members of the audience saying, and if I can sort of paraphrase, how they prove that they're essentially, not part of the problem, prove anti-racism. And I think that's a really great way of confronting that this is a difficult conversation. We said it at the top, we're not shying away from the difficult conversation, but it means that it's confronting allyship. So Grace, I want to give everyone an opportunity to speak on this if they'd like. And Grace, I'd love to start with you on how we can all be allies and how our audience can be allies.
Yeah, there are various different trainings for allies, Asian Americans advancing justice. I know in Chicago had been running a bystander intervention training, and just like Russell said, taking lessons from history. So they actually took a curriculum that Hollebeck had developed post 9/11 for folks to stand up to be bystander interveners for the Muslim community, and adapted it in the Asian American context. So I highly encourage folks that want to be able to help. Like one of the most disheartening things that we've seen is the most recent incident in New York, in Manhattan, when an Asian American woman was attacked, and the doorman just closed the door and just watched and didn't do anything. I know that sometimes people may be frozen in the moment because they didn't know exactly what to do, but get trained so that you have resources, so that you have options. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you always have to jump in and help, but it does lay out all the different options and how you would evaluate the situation, and that's very helpful. 2, listen to these stories. Follow, all of my, the other panelists here, all of us have various different platforms, either through our organizations or our own social media, that we share information, we share events, we share activities that you can do to help. And then all the Asian American organizations also have that. We want to highlight the culture and the contributions. We want to highlight both the struggles, historical struggles of the Asian American community. We don't want to overlook those, but we also want to highlight Asian American accomplishments. And most important, that we want to make sure that we have this general message that we do belong, and that we are an important part of this country, and we have always been an integral part of the fabric of this country.
Thank you, Grace. And I actually did drop the link to that bystander intervention training and resource in the chat. So if you'd like to learn more, please go ahead and take a look at that. I do want to make sure that we have so many questions, so we will obviously make sure that resources get around to everybody, but I do want to make sure that we have an ability for our panelists to kind of have a closing statement and to sort of, their message to both the AAPI members of the audience as well as allies. It might be a mixed message. It might be to just one. you know, if we could just kind of go down the list here, and I'll just personally thank everybody, please, from me and from Unite for your participation. I mean, this has been incredible, and I don't think we anticipated nearly as much of as many of these questions, and they've been wonderful. So please take a look, and this panel discussion will be available later. But I'd love to kind of start through the list here, and maybe, you know, Russell, I'm seeing you first on my screen, so if I can throw to you, you know, kind of your closing statement, and maybe your message to the audience here, as we sort of wrap up.
Yeah, my closing words are, and this is actually particularly for the Asian American community, but to our allies as well, is that I'm afraid that unless we deal with racism in our own lives, we will just become perpetuators of that cycle of violence, that hurt people hurt others, abused people abuse others, people who experience racism act racistly towards others. And Asians can become anti-white, we can become anti-black. And unless we actually acknowledge our pain and how we're hurt and deal with it, unless we center that for a moment and deal with that messiness, we're going to subconsciously repeat history like we've been saying. And especially for our young people, this is a moment where they could develop racial empathy. Rather than telling them to fight back or to hide from it, what we need to do rather than fight or flight is to go into flock mode, to find power and strength in each other, to find solace and grieve together, but then also to support each other in healing. And so I encourage Unite employees to do what you're doing, come together, share what's happening, and let's heal from this so that not only can Asian Americans now be a group that's standing up and voicing our concerns, but that we become racial healers for this nation. That's what we need. This is a broken society. And even though we're on the outside now, that's our strength, to see what's wrong with America, to see what's wounded about America, and then to be the healers of America. So this is actually our reckoning, our inflection time, to really dig deep, flock together, learn from Jez and Joanne and Grace. And I think what we can do is actually be prophetic, to be an America where we want to belong.
And maybe next, if we can move over to Joanne, some final words, and sort of your final call to our audience here.
Thank you. So I think in terms of a final call to the audience or to anybody who's listening, I would just share a very brief story about how I decided to do what I did, which was to start the Korean Vegan and then turn it from a food blog to what it is today. And it was because I, like Russell, saw that the country was broken and I didn't know how to heal it, but I felt like I had to do something. And I looked around to everyone around me and was like, well, should I just do what everybody else is doing? And I really wanted to challenge the notion that my best use of my time and my talent was to simply do what everybody else was doing. And I realized that that might not be the most value that I could bring to this conversation. So I took stock and I tried to figure out how I felt about things first, so that whatever message I was giving was 1000% honest. And then I thought about, well, what skills do I have that could allow me to effectively communicate these things in a way that maybe other people are not? And that's why I started sharing the stories about my family on the Korean Vegan. And I think what I would leave for everybody is, when you ask about how can I be a better ally, how can I be an activist, how can I further this conversation? I think the first thing that people should probably do is to take stock of themselves, have that internal conversation with themselves. Well, how do I feel about this? What do I think about this? Do I know everything that I really need to know in order to be an effective communicator about these things? Do that investigation. And then also ask yourself, well, what am I good at? It doesn't have to be what the other person is doing. It can be what you're specifically equipped to do. And I think that that is the way to effectuate real change and also to leave a mark on a person in a way that furthers that conversation in a really productive way. I know I sometimes feel so much pressure to do the right thing and say the right thing and be the best activist and use my platform and blah, 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 all those things. And sometimes it's so important to just go back to yourself and say, okay, what do I think? How do I effectively communicate this? And what do I uniquely bring to this conversation? And that is a way of empowering yourself to do the work that I think needs to be done. I want to thank everyone, all the panelists and all the people who facilitated this conversation, all of those who have participated. It's just been such an amazing opportunity to be part of this.
And Grace, we'll cut over to you for your final words here.
Yeah, thank you. I am so glad that we had this panel today, and I think that as a lot of us have expressed, the past year or the past few weeks have been emotional, and it's difficult sometimes to, as we kind of are in this reactive mode, to figure out longer term what the how to respond strategically. I like to echo a little bit of what Russell has been saying, is that, you know, we're in a moment where we can begin to build towards positive changes and move towards more a brighter future for this country. And I think that what I want to say to everyone that's on this call is ask yourself how you can be a bridge to bridge the differences and some of these discrimination and hate or slights. And I see, you know, sometimes we do see this Pan-Asian movement of Asian Americans coming together, but I also have seen, particularly in the Chinese community, mostly because Chinatowns tend to be a little bit more conservative in terms of ideology. Some folks kind of in this moment of being discriminated against or having crimes perpetrated against them tend to retrench and go back to positions that are more protective. In a recent conversation about we're trying to push for legislation for Asian American history to be taught in Illinois public schools, and we are pushing for that, and a lot of folks have worked hard on it. And most recently, there have been some voices about why isn't this included, why isn't that included, and I think that we really would like folks to think again about the bigger picture. What kind of progress are we trying to push for, rather than focus on the differences? And this is for both Asian American groups as well as for other groups. Like, how do we work together, and how do we think about the commonalities, the common interests, rather than the individual differences?
Can hear me now? Yes, okay. Echoing everything that's been said, and I think we're really seeing this call to action more than ever in our lifetimes to, yes, come together, to really listen to each other, to really hold each other in care, and know that all of our movements are interconnected. Our lives are interconnected. Our movements for justice and equity are interconnected. And it's also not possible to talk about these systems of racism without talking about classism, sexism, queerphobia, ableism. So really learning, just it's a muscle. I think of justice as a muscle. The more that we use it, the easier it gets for us to speak up, and the easier it gets for us to understand what's happening and what role we can play. I think Rohini put this into the chat, but I compiled a list of resources at bit.ly/amplifyAAPI, all lowercase, bit.ly/amplifyAAPI. And this is a list of resources where you can read about, read essays and read from voices, Asian American Pacific Islander voices, so we can just get familiar with what are the perspectives, what's happening, how can we help, and there's also a few other resources I'll share, especially if you identify as an Asian American woman or a non-binary Asian. You can go to @jointhecosmos, JOINTHECOSMOS, and they provide a lot of care circles, a lot of community circles for Asian American women, non-binary folks. There's Ethel's Club, ETHELS Club, and that is a social and wellness platform for people of color. And there's also Frequency Mind, and this is open to everyone at Frequency Mind, and they have breathwork classes, classes where meditation courses, and I think that there's so many powerful tools even in our Eastern ancestry, right? The pranayama breath technique, just meditation, tapping, emotional freedom technique, acupuncture. Lean into those tools because we really have to sustain ourselves to sustain the movement. And lastly, I'll leave you with some affirmations because I'm big on the power of language. I think that the words that we speak become this ecosystem that we live in. So just some words that we can use to affirm ourselves and the role we play. I play an essential role in the progress of our ecosystem. I honor my experiences. My presence has influence. My voice is valid. I practice speaking up. So affirming these things to ourselves can also help us continue to show up in the ways we need.
Well, thank you. That was really an incredible 90 minutes of discussion. Thank you, Russell, Grace, Jez, Joanne, and especially Suzanne for moderating a really incredible panel. As an ally, or what I like to think of myself as an ally, I learned a lot in this conversation, and I think listening is one of the most important first steps that you have to do before you can get to understanding and then action. And so I want to thank everybody for joining us, for the engagement in the chat. And with that, I think that's the end of this session. So thank you very much.